All right. Welcome, everybody, to our JHA Wiki Virtual Toolkit series. Briefly, and by the way of housekeeping, please put your microphone on mute. We've heard dogs and barking and traffic. Would love to have it be as quiet as possible. Definitely drop questions in the chat as you have them. So if you have not been to our JHM Wiki series, our Johns Hopkins Medicine collaboration with Wiki, Women, Infant, Children, and Youth, the goal of this series is to engage and amplify. I am Alison Agu. I'm professor of adult and pediatric infectious diseases. I'm the director of this program. JHM Wiki is a collaboration of multiple programs across Baltimore City, including ours, the Pediatric Adolescent HIV/AIDS program, the Women's Health Program, Sinai Support Services, University of Maryland, the Emerge Gender Clinic, and Johns Hopkins Psychiatry Services. The vision of our program and the series is to achieve a more coordinated response to HIV by establishing some mutually beneficial relationships, increasing the quality of care that we provide to our community. Our mission is to build upon our existing structures and systems to create a dedicated network of wiki providers, so providers of care to women, infant, children, and youth, to coordinate multidisciplinary systems of care. This is our, I say, flagship series, our toolkit series, and the goal of this is to engage and amplify experts. And so while we'll have featured individuals like Kennedy Hagens today, we're all experts in something. And so if you see something, say something, and want to share, we'd love to hear from you. Really do want to acknowledge our funders, HRSA. Next slide. All right. Today is my absolute pleasure to introduce Kennedy Hagens. I'm going to brag about her for a little bit. She is an associate healthcare attorney at Gordon Feinblatt LLC in Baltimore. She practices a practice that involves regulatory advice to healthcare professionals and provides support on a variety of corporate matters. Her knowledge of the healthcare system extends beyond her legal expertise, as she holds both a bachelor's and a master's in public health from Syracuse. Giving you your flowers. During her time in law school, Kennedy participated in the Medical Legal Partnership Clinic at the University of Maryland, Francis Carey School of Law, providing legal assistance to clients living with HIV in Baltimore City. And as a clinic student, she supported the efforts of the Maryland Coalition to decriminalize HIV to repeal MD Code. General 18-601.1. It's a law that created a misdemeanor that was punishable by up to 3 years in prison if an individual was known to knowingly transfer or attempt to transfer HIV to another person, regardless of intent. So we don't think there's anybody who's good or as good to talk about this as you. And today you'll talk about HIV and the law, and turning it over to you, Kennedy.
Right. Thank you so much, Allison. And give me just a second to get this screen set up. And is everyone able to see the slides?
Perfect.
Great, amazing. So first of all, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, especially to everyone joining online to hear about such an important and timely topic. Huge shout out to the entire Johns Hopkins medicine community and the Wiki community for reaching out to me to come and speak on this. It's also very timely because tomorrow is actually HIV is Not a Crime Day. And if you are unfamiliar, that is a national day of advocacy to raise awareness about these criminalization laws and really amplify the voices of people living with HIV. So I'm very happy to give you all this knowledge, this information, so you can go out there and start advocating for change. Before we jump into our discussion, I just want to give you all a little bit more detail about my background, my experience, and where I learned about HIV criminalization and became passionate about this issue. So as Allison shared, I was a law student at the University of Maryland, Francis King Carey School of Law. And as part of a requirement for graduation, all law students must complete what's known as a clinical law experience. This is really an experience to teach people how to become a lawyer, how to serve in that role prior to entering professional practice. And in order to do that, I chose to join the Medical Legal Partnership Clinic. This clinic was very near and dear to my heart, and I was drawn to it because it operates on the premise that clients' health and well-being can be impacted by factors that are outside of their control. So that can be things like housing instability, economic disadvantages, access to education. These are all known as social determinants of health. And social determinants of health can either work towards improving your health outcomes or deteriorating them, just depending on what you're dealing with. So the focus in this clinic was to explore the role that lawyers can play in advancing these goals. And the clinic does that by partnering with the University of Maryland Medical Center's HIV treatment clinic, known as the Thrive program, and partnering with social workers through the University of Maryland to treat clients and work with clients living with HIV in Baltimore. So they do receive Ryan White grant funding, and eligible individuals can receive free legal services. My participation in this clinic gave me access to what's known as the Preparing the Future or PTF program. And that is actually an interdisciplinary program offered to students at the University of Maryland, Baltimore, run by the Mid-Atlantic AIDS and Education Training Center. And we learned how to collaborate with each other. So these are classes with nursing students, social work students, other fellow law students, medical students, all of these professionals that at some point in their careers will play a role in the health outcomes of their clients living with HIV. So I became very passionate during my time in clinic. And when I was presented with the opportunity to work with Free State Justice and the Maryland HIV Decriminalization Coalition, I jumped at the opportunity. So now today, I'm excited to teach all of you about this topic and help you with your understanding. Looking at our agenda for today, I want to start by giving a general overview of HIV criminalization. Then I want you all to be able to understand what the legal landscape is. How do these laws look nationally, and really how do they look in Maryland? Then I want us to discuss why we should care about this. How does this impact public health? How does this impact people living with HIV? And how can we make change? What reform efforts exist? And how can you get involved after you leave this presentation today? At the end of this, I will be sticking around for questions and a short discussion about anything that might not have been covered or that might be lingering on your mind. So with that being said, let's get into it. What is HIV criminalization? The term HIV criminalization refers to the practice of prosecuting individuals for actions related to HIV exposure, transmission, or non-disclosure. And these laws often apply even when no harm is caused at all. So essentially, these laws wrongfully use a person's HIV status in criminal prosecutions and use that to heighten charges or punishments simply because the person is living with HIV. So specifically, it describes laws that criminalize conduct that's otherwise legal due to their status, or increases penalties for illegal conduct based on that person's status. So for example, in terms of legal conduct, it is a legal activity for two consenting adults to engage in sex in the United States. However, a lot of HIV criminalization statutes make that an illegal activity if a person is living with HIV. Similarly, with the HIV-specific sentence enhancements that increase penalties for illegal conduct, these are very prevalent throughout the country, and they do things like turn a misdemeanor into a felony. So a misdemeanor is a much less severe crime with much shorter jail sentences, if any jail sentence at all, whereas a felony is actually the most serious crime you can commit. It can result in serious jail time, loss of various rights, including the loss of your right to vote. It leads to even more discrimination in terms of your ability to secure jobs. People may not be willing to rent apartments to you. All of these things under the sun, you name it, that is the issue with being charged with a felony. So just because you're a person living with HIV, the penalties, if you're charged with a crime, can be increased tenfold. And currently, a little over 2/3 of the United States have actually enacted HIV criminal laws, including Maryland. The worst part is, in some instances, a lot of these states also require people living with HIV to register as sex offenders due to their status. And the consequences of that are exactly as they sound. Even more discrimination, even more stigma, and even more barriers to living your life. Most of these laws were passed when less was known about the actual risks of HIV, and that's why they're overly broad. And they tend to single out HIV to be handled differently than any other STI. And as many people are aware, HIV and STIs, if either is left untreated, they can seriously harm a person. So there's no reason to really target HIV as this quote unquote most evil STI. So, like I said, the laws are overly broad because they're so different in every state. They're subject to different interpretations, and they actually don't reflect best criminal law practices. What I mean by that is I started this presentation saying people can be impacted by HIV criminalization laws even when no harm is caused. Best criminal law practices is for the punishment to reflect the crime that a person is charged with. If no harm is caused, it doesn't really make sense for someone to have to face a felony punishment. And it can be assumed that these laws were created with the goal of reducing any instances of an intentional transmission of HIV. But research shows that these HIV specific laws don't actually change people's behaviors. And criminal prosecution just treats people like criminals and serves to only fuel stigma and discrimination against people living with HIV. So I want to show you all a map just so you can understand what I'm talking about a little clearer. So this is the most recent, most accurate update of HIV criminalization laws in the United States. And this data is provided by the Center for HIV Law and Policy. As you can see, there are currently 32 states that have offenses that criminalize exposure to and or transmission of HIV. Looking at the key and the chart, there are 14 states where HIV is specifically named with no other disease listed. So these are specific criminalization and punishments of HIV, and you'll see that Maryland falls into that category. Next, you'll see that there are 4 states with HIV named in the law among other diseases. So it might be HIV and hepatitis and herpes, but either way, HIV is specifically named. Next, you'll see that there are 5 states where a communicable disease is named as an offense in the law. But when you go into the statutory or administrative or case law, you'll see that the definition of communicable disease specifically names HIV. And I'm sorry, it sounded like someone had something to share. No? Okay. So what I mean by going into the statutory code or reading case law is you'll look at a statute and it'll say one thing, but it may not define everything that it's trying to say. So you'll have to go into the administrative code, read definitions, or even read a case to understand what the definition of communicable disease is. So what that means is there are 5 states where if you look at that definition, HIV is the communicable disease that they're speaking about. Moving down further, there's 9 states where communicable disease is named in the law, but the definition is broad enough to discuss HIV. So that's still something where a person living with HIV can be charged with an offense and face severe penalties. If you can see the small stars on the map, that also refers to the states that may require registration as a sex offender as part of the punishment for conviction under that HIV specific law. So very broad. It ranges throughout the country. It's hard to figure out how the language will be interpreted in some circumstances. And one very important thing that's not listed on this map is that there are actually 25 states that have used HIV status, a person's knowledge of their HIV status, to prove a specific element of a general criminal offense that does not mention HIV at all. So I'm going to use Maryland law as an example to kind of explain that a little bit better. In the state of Maryland, reckless endangerment is an offense, it's a misdemeanor, and it refers to conduct that creates a substantial risk of death or serious physical injury to another. There's been several instances in Maryland where people living with HIV were charged with reckless endangerment because they engaged in sex with another individual. One case I'll highlight is that a man pled guilty to 2 counts of reckless endangerment after he engaged in unprotected sex with 2 women without disclosing his HIV status. There was evidence submitted that he texted the women, letting them know that he was undetectable, but despite that evidence, he was still charged with this crime. So what some people may not be aware of is if a person living with HIV has their viral load suppressed for a certain amount of time and they become undetectable, that renders HIV untransmittable. So despite this man being undetectable, he was charged with creating a substantial risk of death or serious physical injury to another, despite the fact that that risk didn't actually exist. So on top of that, reckless endangerment is actually a pretty serious misdemeanor in Maryland, where people can be sent to state prison instead of just a county detention center. The problem with that is that a state prison is a much more traumatic and harsher experience than just being in a county detention center, because the state prison is meant for long-term harsh criminal convicted sentences. County detention centers are really for holding, they're for people who are awaiting trial, and they're run by local county officials. It's not as intense as what state prison is. So this is an instance where the man's positive HIV status was used to prove that he created a substantial risk of death or serious physical injury to another. Assault is another general crime that is often used to criminalize or increase sentences for people living with HIV. And assault is a misdemeanor that involves unlawful force or threats of force causing fear of immediate harm. There's been at least 2 instances of people being convicted of assault due to their HIV status. And one that I'll highlight is that a man was charged with second-degree assault for spitting on a police officer. Um, the man was HIV positive. However, spitting is not a viable means of HIV transmission. So he was still charged with additional counts of assault because the police officer felt that there was unlawful force used or a threat of force that caused him to have immediate harm. So it can be tricky. As you can see, it's hard to interpret how status may be used in certain instances. But now that you have a bit of a better idea of what HIV criminalization is and its broad scope, let's really talk about how it's applied to various groups of people. What is the application of these HIV criminalization laws? So these laws are disproportionately enforced based on race and gender, and that enforcement varies by state. You could see a little bit of that in the map that I showed you because the laws are so different. They disproportionately affect marginalized groups such as communities of color, transgender women, sex workers, and even incarcerated individuals. And Black people are the most impacted by HIV criminalization laws. So these are the populations that are most likely to be affected negatively by social determinants of health and most likely to be impacted by racial inequities. So they're much more vulnerable to being in contact with the criminal justice system because of these other factors that are playing a role in their lives. And the more contact you have with the criminal justice system, the more likely it is that your status is going to be used against you in a legal context as you keep having more and more contact. So let's look at some charts. Let's look at some data to see what the demographics look like. So here I have data from several states. And what this really shows is that Black people living with HIV are more likely to be over-policed and convicted for these crimes than their peers. So for each of these states, the blue represents the state population of Black people, while red represents HIV-related convictions. As you can see, the red is significantly higher than what the state population of Black people is. Statistically speaking, if a certain demographic only makes up a small percentage of a population, then the way the demographic is impacted by a state law should reflect that small percentage. But clearly, that's not the case due to the other factors that I just shared with you all. Looking at this data from Virginia, this really shows you that Black men specifically are the most disproportionately impacted in general by HIV criminalization laws. Again, Black men are among the lowest percentage of the state's population, yet they are arrested and convicted at a significantly higher rate than their peers. Despite only making up 9% of Virginia's population, they account for 59% of HIV-related arrests and HIV-related convictions. Whereas white men in Virginia account for 30% of the state's population, but are only making up 28% of HIV-related arrests and 35% of HIV-related convictions. And where Black men in general are the most disproportionately impacted by these laws, Black women are vulnerable to sentence enhancement under sex work laws. So compared to their peers, they are often charged with prostitution, and in most states that is a misdemeanor, but their sentences will be enhanced because of HIV status, turning that misdemeanor into a felony. And in many cases, that sex work enhancement requires registration as a sex offender, depending on the state that you're in. So again, the blue still represents the state population of Black women, and the red is what represents HIV-related sex work arrests among Black women. And the data is staggering. So as a result of this disproportionate enforcement, Black people are far less likely to seek effective treatment or assistance, and their viral suppression rates are much lower than their white peers. Now, let's look at all of this through a Maryland lens. As Allison stated, Maryland's HIV criminalization statute can be found at Maryland Code Section 18-601.1, and that statute criminalizes the knowing transmission of HIV from one person to another. That misdemeanor has penalties of up to $2,500 as a fine or up to 3 years in jail. That is a lot of money and a lot of time to be spent in jail just because someone is living with HIV. It is a very broad law. It applies to all kinds of HIV exposure, and it doesn't actually require any transmission for someone to be charged under this law. So, on top of that, it doesn't account for any person undergoing effective treatment. Like I stated before, a person was charged with reckless endangerment despite having an undetectable viral load. So, this is a very, very broad law, and Maryland does not allow for any affirmative defenses. So, someone hearing me talk about this might think that they could speak with their partner prior to engaging in sex and receive their consent before having sex, and that would prevent them from being criminalized under this law. Well, Maryland's statute actually does not allow for that because of its broad application, and it's difficult to think of a defense for this. So because of that, it's also hard for prosecutors to prove what knowing transmission is because they need evidence of intent to transmit, evidence of transmission, or evidence of other behaviors that indicate there was an intent to spread HIV. Part of the reason it's difficult is, again, this law does not account for people who are undergoing effective treatment. So it's hard to prove that there was a knowing transmission of HIV. Most evidence is based on conflicting testimony, one person's word being used against another. And this is often how we end up with prosecution under general criminal laws, with HIV being used to prove certain elements of those laws. So Baltimore City specifically accounts for 32% of all of Maryland's HIV-related cases, with Montgomery County and Prince George's County making up the majority of the rest of the data. But only 10% of HIV-related charges actually result in conviction, while half of them result in plea deals, often just for the person to avoid HIV-related charges. So, for example, a person could be arrested and charged with reckless endangerment and be charged under this Maryland HIV criminalization statute. In order to avoid having that charge under the HIV criminalization statute show up on their record, and essentially disclosing the fact that they are living with HIV, people will take plea deals and may take guilty pleas just to avoid that disclosure from happening. So these circumstances make it very difficult for individuals who may be able to walk away from other criminal charges, but have to make these considerations very quickly while they're in a very vulnerable state. So that's what it really looks like in Maryland. Now, I'm giving you all of this information and all of this data, but I really want you to understand why we should care about this. What does this mean? So, as I've alluded to, the way that these laws are applied only serve to worsen health disparities, the gaps in health outcomes that we're seeing in various communities. Telling people that they're a potential criminal based only on a diagnosed health condition is extremely harmful, and it only serves to undermine public health efforts. For people not living with HIV and hearing that those living with HIV are potential criminals, that creates stigma. That causes people to treat those around them in a different manner because, in their minds, this is someone who could be a criminal. And a lot of the criminal activities that supporters of criminalization are fearful of are things that can be addressed by general criminal and assault laws. Yet HIV is the thing that keeps being targeted. So in these instances where there's quote unquote intentional transmitters, that's first of all a very rare occurrence, but that's often what you hear when you go into legislative session and you hear people trying to prevent criminalization laws from being repealed. It's them being scared that someone is maliciously going to try to spread HIV, or that someone is going to run up to them and try to throw blood on them to spread HIV. All of these things that if someone living with HIV were to hear it, it sounds like it sounds insane for the most part. But these are very real fears that people have because they are uneducated and because they don't fully understand HIV as a whole. So in the event that HIV criminalization laws are repealed or they're modernized, you can punish someone for these evil acts that you're fearful of. Like I said, every state has a general assault statute that provides prosecution for anyone that has intent to harm another person. Uh, on top of that, there's a number of evidence-based HIV prevention strategies that have been proven to reduce the likelihood of transmission. Things like condoms, medications like PrEP that are used to prevent HIV transmission to people who are at an elevated risk of exposure. These are the scientific advances that should really be informing our laws. But across the country, most of these laws are just based on evidence from the 1980s. So, what can we do to really change things? What can we actually do about it? Well, by coming to discussions like this, learning about the fact that the laws are there, and educating those around you, that's how we can start making changes and start making a difference. We can join reform efforts and we can start to educate legislators as well to help work towards repealing these laws. As providers, if there's any providers on the call, although there's a public health obligation to report positive HIV statuses in some instances, this information is still HIPAA protected in terms of the patient's identity, and the patient's identity needs to remain confidential. Similarly, the disclosure of that status in a medical record is not something that's discoverable or admissible evidence in proceedings in Maryland, so they can't use patient notes against you. So providers need to be comfortable being these allies for people living with HIV, and people living with HIV need to feel comfortable speaking with their providers about their concerns and feel comfortable disclosing the fears that they might have. So there's other things providers can do to also continue to be allies. I've spoken a lot about outdated language, outdated practices. There's small things that you can do within your own clinical environments just to help make your patients feel more comfortable. Just by going through and updating your confidentiality policies, changing how many people get to touch a person's medical record if they are living with HIV, working with them to understand how they want certain issues discussed instead of in front of family members that they may not have disclosed their status to. Even doing things as simple as updating your protocols within your offices to remove stigmatizing language, that can have a very big impact on your clinical practice and can be used as an opportunity to educate your coworkers and educate the people around you. Um, so by doing all of these things, we're all in a better position to advocate for change. In my own experience, I've worked with a few people living with HIV who were still uncomfortable with their providers, but wanted to start working towards being comfortable so that they could continue receiving treatment and so that they could continue promoting testing within their community. So now that we know how we can start making changes, I want to talk to you all a little bit about the reform efforts that currently exist. A lot of the data that I've shared with you all today came from the Center for HIV Law and Policy, and that is a national resource center that is working every single day to reduce the impact of HIV on vulnerable communities. That's a national policy research center. They have fact sheets that you can use to hand out to people to inform them about HIV criminalization. And they create more specific maps than the ones that I showed you, where you can really do a deep dive and see how these HIV specific sentence enhancements impact certain communities, and stay up to date really on how these laws change because they are changing every single day. Similarly, a lot of the data, the charts and graphs that I use today came from a national report from the UCLA School of Law Williams Institute. And I specifically worked with Nathan Cisneros, who was one of the people who spearheaded this report last year when I was doing reform efforts with Free State Justice. And their website is incredibly interactive. You can go through and see what the risk of transmission is for various activities. And you can go through and see the specific cases that I may have discussed today. Similarly, have to give a plug to Free State Justice because they have been working very hard to repeal Maryland's HIV criminalization statute for years now. Free State Justice is a Maryland-based group working to advocate for the rights of LGBTQ Marylanders and their families, and they spearhead the HIV Decriminalization Coalition. Some exciting news to really share with everyone, especially if you're here in Maryland, is that Free State Justice and the coalition have had recent success with the decriminalization bill that they presented in this year's session. So they introduced what's known as the Carlton R. Smith Jr. HIV Modernization Act, and that's known as Senate Bill 356. For the first time ever, a couple of weeks ago, this bill passed out of the Senate committee, and that's never happened before. In fact, the Senate committee has been the biggest roadblock to decriminalization in Maryland. And now that it has actually made it out of this committee, there are very high hopes that Maryland will no longer have an HIV criminalization statute. If you're unfamiliar with the legislative process, first it needs to go into committees in both the Senate and the House. Both of those committees need to approve the bill. And then following approval, the full House and the full Senate then need to vote on it. If there's a majority vote on both, the governor will then receive the bill. And Governor Wes Moore has said in the past that if that bill comes across his desk, he will be signing it. So that is something to be very excited about here in Maryland. And if you're listening to me present and you're thinking, I want to do a little bit more than just share this information with my friends and family, I want to get involved, here are a few more significant ways that you can start making changes. You can do things like supporting your local and national campaign efforts. I mentioned Free State. I mentioned the Center for Healthcare Law and Policy. There's other things that you can research online and sort of get involved, but these efforts are ongoing. Additionally, you have the option of contacting local legislators about HIV criminalization, and that's a lot of the work I did last year. You can go online, see who the legislators are. They do have their phone numbers and email addresses listed, and you can send them your thoughts and opinions about HIV criminalization, share with them your support for the bill, and start really educating them on what you've learned. You can start actively participating with Free State, and you can even write testimony. If you go online and track the bill on the Maryland General Assembly's website, you will be prompted to submit testimony if it's needed, depending on the dates when the bill is being heard. So there's a ton of ways to get involved. And if you're still unsure on how you want to make a change, how you want to start advocating, feel free to ask. But all of these reform efforts exist, and all of these are wonderful ways to start advocating for change. So to kind of conclude things for us, I just want to make it clear that HIV criminalization does not reduce the risk of transmission and only serves to undermine public health goals. It creates stigma that really negatively impacts those living with HIV, and it's really based on outdated science. So it's up to us to stay educated, stay informed, use the resources that I've shared with you all because they're the most accurate data you can get, and make sure you understand how you can start navigating this legal landscape. One thing I want to make sure everyone is clear on, by advocating for change, we're really improving public health outcomes for all and improving the livelihood of marginalized groups everywhere. So I'm very happy to have had all of you here as part of this discussion today. Very happy to have shared about this topic. And I hope that you've learned something new throughout the time that you've joined this call. And I really want to thank everyone for having me here.
Great. Thank you so much, Kimberly. That was great. There are a couple questions that have already come in the chat, and I have a few. Maybe I'll start with Toya's more of a clarification question. Well, I'll make it a two-part question. So one, what is the bar to prove intentional transmission? And then second to that is, does somebody who's convicted of intentional transmission have to register as a sex offender? So I created a two-part question out of her question.
And your first question was, what is the
bar to prove intentional transmission
in Maryland?
in Maryland?
Okay, so you're asking like what actual evidence is needed?
Exactly.
So that's the thing that's tricky, and that's part of the reason why only 10% of these actually resulted in conviction, and most of them are actually because of sexual assault. So in Maryland, you would need to be able to prove that there was an intent to transmit, prove that there was actual transmission that occurred. And like I stated, if someone is undetectable, there likely was not any transmission at all. And in Maryland specifically, when someone is sexually assaulted, and it's proven that there was a prohibited exposure. So with Maryland having that broad law, there's a lot of activities that could be proven as prohibited exposure. if someone is sexually assaulted in that manner, the victim of sexual assault can actually petition the court to require mandatory testing of the person that is alleged to have assaulted them. So because of that, those are some of the main instances where there's actually been a charge under the HIV specific statute, because that mandatory testing proved that the person was living with HIV. But other than that, it's actually very difficult to have a conviction under these laws. And that's where they start moving towards the general statutes like reckless endangerment, assault. And then when it becomes known that someone has HIV, that's when they start trying to prove that there was a risk of serious injury or physical harm. So I hope that made sense.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And then the second part to her questions about registration
Oh,
as a sex offender.
Maryland does not require you to register as a sex offender if convicted under this. They are not a part of the 5 states that require sex offender registration.
Great. And then I'll guess that's your initial question, Keith, because I think that's the part, the crux of some of what people's opinions oftentimes hang on. So what if the person is on PrEP and undetectable, I think is his question in terms of.
Yeah. So in Maryland, again, that's the whole reason why this law doesn't make sense. It doesn't account for people being on PrEP or being undetectable. And that's part of the reason why it's hard to convict them under these laws. You get into court and it's like, well, I couldn't have transmitted HIV, but that person is pushing that they were in a risky situation. And that's how they're proving things like reckless endangerment. But the law doesn't actually account for anybody being on PrEP or being undetectable. So it's essentially like it doesn't matter that you can't transmit HIV to anybody.
So just to be clear, so the person, let's say who was assaulted, that person's on PrEP, or because the person's positive is undetectable, there's no transmission. So just in terms of where does PrEP come into the equation, more for the person who was exposed?
I'm sorry, you're asking how does.
Yeah, because if the person who was assaulted, because in terms of we're talking about
Yeah, if they're on PrEP, the law also doesn't account for them having protection against transmission as well, because the basis is still not based on current science. It's still based on the 80s. So it doesn't account for the person actually they themselves being protected against it, and they can still be considered victims of that sexual assault.
I would love for Keith to unmute and ask his question about the moral and ethical issues, because I think this is what gets often the conversation going. So I'd love to hear, Keith, if you're still there to
Yeah,
unmute
thank you. Yeah, I was just going to put a note in the chat. It seems like the blame is being put on the person who is HIV positive.
Correct.
But what about, for it, the person that you described, for example, earlier, where he told the person that he was undetectable. To me, in that case, that was a situation where the person just made a choice. So how could you come and then file criminal charges against this person when literally they're telling you I'm HIV positive, but I'm undetectable? You made a choice still to have intercourse with this person. You're just as responsible. I mean, you're the one who's responsible. And
Right.
so, yeah, there are legal aspects to it, but does it really make it right? Is it really a moral issue? There seem to be some moral issues involved in this, as well as, is it really right for me to tell someone that I'm HIV positive? When I think my take on this is that everybody it's your responsibility to take care of yourself.
Right.
And if you meet someone and you don't know what their status is, and you go ahead and you engage in sexual activity, you made a choice. Now that's different for rape. But I'm talking about where people come together and they indulge in these activities and then later find out that the person was positive. But maybe if you had gotten shit, if you are like, hey, you protect yourself, you make a choice. So that's where the contradiction seems to come into play. And I never forget this was way back, years back, when Magic Johnson first disclosed that he was HIV positive. And all of a sudden, these women come out of the woodwork and wanted to file lawsuits against him because alleging that he knew that he was positive, but yet he engaged in sex with him. Do you all remember that?
I know what you're talking
We
about.
do. We're dating ourselves by age, but I remember that.
Yeah. So you said I'm telling my age.
Yep.
But anyway, but yeah, so I do think it's a moral issue to it, it's an ethical issue to it. And I do understand that there's a legal issue too, because there have been, at least it was back in the past, it was this, it seemed like some people that were HIV positive, or there have been stories told about people being HIV positive, and they go on this revenge. Oh, I'm positive I'm going to infect everybody else.
Thanks, Keith. No, definitely. I mean, I think, Kendi, it was really important, I think, highlighting the idea that there's the assault, and it's still going to be an assault, and that should not be elevated just because there was, again, someone's positive, aside the issue of intent, right? Because that's what
Yeah.
Keith's talking about with these stories early in the epidemic where someone went on a rampage, and it was always, interesting to see those disparities that you list in terms of who's accused and who's convicted, because it was always a Black man in this small rural town who passed it on to all these fair victims, quote unquote. But
Yeah.
that's not the majority of what we're talking about. People who are living their lives and who are criminalized by this. And so an assault is an assault and should be prosecuted as an assault, and someone's undetectable and living their best life with HIV, that should not elevate the assault or the prosecution for whatever reason. So that was an
Exactly.
important distinction.
And you all really spoke a lot about kind of the role that the media has played in advancing stigma and all of this, because you all are speaking about things that happened back in the 80s, and that is still what's informing the opinions of a lot of the legislators within these states. Just last year, and even the year before, working towards decriminalizing Maryland, a lot of the arguments and questions and pushback were about people citing these super old and very rare cases where some evil man decided to go on a rampage and try to transmit HIV to a ton of people. But that is among the rarest of the rare. Like, that's not something that should be at the forefront of people's minds when they sit and really understand how HIV is transmitted. And I think the other big issue is, while this is a legal issue, I really view this as a public health issue overall. There's so many layers and intersectionalities that go into this. There's a level of trauma that comes with being Black. There's a level of trauma that comes with having a positive HIV status. And now there's the fact that you could be over-policed even more by having both of these identities. So the media has played a crucial role in pushing this discrimination and pushing this stigma, all for the sake of spinning a story for the most part. And that is unfortunately what is informing a lot of the legislators today.
I think you also had a very interesting point that I've thought about, and it was helpful to hear you talk more about this. Oftentimes in, our medical records, we'll say, how did they acquire it? And someone will say, oh, I acquired it from blah, blah, blah. And I'm oftentimes thoughtful about what we're writing in our records, because you actually don't know that is how somebody acquired it, in the sense that when you look at some of the studies of partners, looking at HIV transmission, the partner in the study was oftentimes not the partner that
Correct.
transmission was linked to. But I think there's this idea that if you write that, can that be used as evidence to say, oh, even your doctor said this was transmitted to you, and it's you saying that the medical record is actually not able to be
Not in
as
Maryland.
important, but it also makes me think about what we actually write in our records, and are we accurate in saying what we say?
Right, exactly. And honestly, my work in clinic is what helped me to start even recognizing these small changes that can have such a serious impact on someone's life. Just seeing the way that certain providers who are treating people with HIV are conscious about the notes that they're writing, how they take the time to make sure that anyone who doesn't need to know certain information is not in the room. Those are the small things that if you're not living with HIV, you're not necessarily thinking about. You're often just thinking, oh, I need to get these notes down. I need to make sure every single detail is in this patient's medical record. But it wasn't until I started working with the Medical Legal Partnership Clinic and working with clients living with HIV that I understood how important it was to know the full version of your client, know what their fears are, and know why you're making the decisions that you're making. So all of that is very important.
Yeah, great question. Keith is asking about why just HIV and not other STIs, and then I see Leon with his hand up. So go ahead.
Yeah, so in some states, it's not just HIV. In some states, it's in Maryland, there's also criminalization statutes for hepatitis C. Other states include a wide range of STIs. It varies broadly. So in some instances, it's not just HIV. It's just that HIV is the only one that tends to be specifically named in most of these states. So a lot of states will have a statute separately for HIV on top of an infectious disease statute. And that infectious disease statute will be broad enough to still encompass HIV. And now you've got double laws going against a person living with HIV. So there are super broad laws that do encompass other forms of diseases. And unfortunately, HIV can still end up falling within those laws as well.
Go ahead, Leon.
So when you were talking, I was thinking about the relationship between the existence of these laws and the fact that so many of our patients constantly find themselves renegotiating their relationship with stigma, and how these laws are, I feel like in many ways, designed to perpetuate that stigma. So the idea of having to constantly confront a time in HIV when we knew nothing and there was all this pandemonium and fear, to where we are now, where there's a biomedical treatments, and that we know a lot about how it's transmitted, how people come in contact with it, how to assess their risk, and I wonder about. So that had me start thinking about the ways in which we combat the stigma as a public health intervention. And so that also made me wonder about the language and the work that you put in to get the criminalization laws out of committee in Maryland. So I'm curious, like, how did you kind of like do this big historical work around combating stigma, getting people to rethink what HIV is, what HIV is not, and then kind of come up with a solution, which is decriminalization, that is aligned with what we know about HIV, but also the people who are affected and living with HIV as well.
Right. Yeah. Great question. So yeah, this is a very big project. After years of work, this is the first time ever that the bill has actually been successful in making it out of committee. But a lot that goes into it is really just, first, you need to understand what HIV is and understand how it's transmitted, so that you can understand how the law applies, so that then you'll be able to argue about how ridiculous the law is. Once you understand what effective treatments exist, once you're educated about what the language of the law is, now you're able to go ahead and combat any questions that legislators may have when you go into Annapolis and talk to them about this. So specifically in my experience, we reached out to the legislators who are on the committees that would read these bills, and we prepared what's known as a one-pager. So when you go to lobby at Maryland General Assembly, legislators don't really have time to sit and hear every single detail, every single fact. You want to make sure you have a brief explanation. You want to make sure you're quick to the points. So our one pager really had quick bulleted list of what this law is. Here's why it's bad. Here's actual public health outcomes. You should repeal it. You want to make sure you're bolding, highlighting the things you want them to see, because again, they're not going to take the time to try to digest anything you say to them, but they might take that piece of paper home, look over it, and be like, oh, I think I'm going to look at this bill today. This is very helpful. Or oftentimes we'd be down in Annapolis right before they went into session. So the last thing that their eyes are seeing is this one pager telling them to repeal Maryland's HIV criminalization statute. And then that would be on their mind as they're in there voting on the bill as well. We did a lot of appointments in legislators' offices. For HIV is Not a Crime Day last year, Free State Justice hosted a lobby day. So they actually went door to door to as many legislators as they could get appointments with, and just went back to back to back educating people one by one, the overwhelming response was legislators being like, oh, wow, I did not know that was a thing. They had no idea PrEP existed, were unfamiliar with the term U equals U, undetectable equals untransmittable. They had no idea, for the most part, that there are other ways to punish people if there's any intentional transmission. Because again, they're just thinking about what they've heard in the media, what they've heard 20, 30, 40 years ago. They're not really taking the time to update their knowledge because they're not people living with HIV. In their minds, it's not something that impacts them. And this law is punishing quote unquote criminals. So you have to make sure you have as much understanding about first HIV and then about HIV criminalization. And then from that point forward, there's really not many questions you won't be able to answer. It's often questions like, well, what if they spit on me? HIV can't be transmitted like that. They often pause, can't really think of another thing to say, or they'll come up with one of those crazy instances that I mentioned, like someone driving by and throwing a bucket of blood on a nurse. That is something that was brought up in the past as a defense against repealing the HIV criminalization statute. These are things that people genuinely believe and that they are really using to continue perpetuating stigma and fighting to continue having criminalization. So if you're able to push back against these types of inquiries and recognize how ridiculous some of these thoughts and opinions are, you're able to really go ahead and start getting legislators to understand how ridiculous it is to keep targeting individuals living with HIV.
Thank you. Toya, you had a question. Toya, I don't see. Yeah, there you are. Go ahead, Toya. Unmute and ask your question.
Yep. All right. Thank you so much. I think you kind of answered my question that I had. And I know that it may be rare that somebody could or would intentionally transmit HIV to someone. But what do you say to a young lady who feels that she was intentionally HIV was intentionally transmitted to her, and then to say that it's, oh, well, it's a decriminalization of it. So we can't look at it in that aspect, but what justice can she get if she knows or if they know in their personal relationship that he did or she, intentionally transferred it to the other partner? Is there nothing that can be done at that point? Or is it nothing that can be done at that point? Or though there's just no justice with the I guess, perceived victim?
So hearing that scenario, that still sounds to me like sexual assault. And that still to me sounds like a route that that young lady could take in order to punish the individual who may have intentionally transmitted HIV. If it's not sexual assault, there are ways that it could be addressed under general assault laws, because if there's evidence that this person intended to harm her, whether it be with a weapon, fists, or a virus, that is still harm that can be addressed under general assault statutes. So that's the question that you just brought up, Toya, is another consideration that's often brought up down in Annapolis, because that does exist. Like, it is rare, but people can be harmed by that type of scenario. But I want to make it very clear that it can often be addressed under assault statutes, and you can increase the counts of assault depending on how severe the harm was without targeting HIV specifically.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
I love that Toya asked this question, because I think that honestly is the crux of it. It's not that if that case happened, that they should get off. And I think that there's, some mixed thoughts about that, in the sense that people think that's what decriminalization is. That absolutely there's an assault, there's an intent, that should be prosecuted. But I completely agree. It's not the HIV itself, then lay it on everything else to make everything worse. So that perfect way to, I think, get us almost to our last question, as I think we have about 5 minutes left. Anybody with any burning questions before we close? Awesome. Ken, that was fantastic. I love the way that you interwove your history and how you got here, and your understanding as a public health person interfaced with your legal expertise. It was really wonderful. We're going to share the slides. They'll be up on our YouTube channel, and people can reach out to you if there's additional questions that
Oh,
come after
yes,
this?
absolutely. You can reach out to me. I will also share the contact information for the Center for Healthcare Law, the Center for HIV Law and Policies Positive Justice Project. So that is the only national coalition that currently exists where communities all over the country are focused solely on HIV decriminalization throughout the country. And in case you forgot, the Center for HIV Law and Policy was who created the maps and who keep up-to-date resources. So that map that I shared was just published yesterday. And they just recently updated their website with several more specific maps and several more fact sheets. I believe they do have a fact sheet specifically for Maryland, where you can go in, review the language of any laws that may impact a person living with HIV. And they also have policy sheets to help you know your rights, help you understand how to maybe talk to a partner when you're scared about what they might do once they hear about your HIV positive status. On top of that, I can also share contact information for anyone who believes they may be eligible for legal services through the Medical Legal Partnership Clinic at University of Maryland School of Law. Again, they receive Ryan White grant funding, so eligible individuals can speak to Professor Sarah Gold for intake. And if your legal issue does align with the clinic or one of our other clinics over at the law school, you may be able to receive legal services through them. And if all else fails, please feel free to call me, email me, and we can chat and discuss a few things. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Lots of kudos in the chat. That was really wonderful, Kim.
Thank you so
really
much.
appreciate your expertise and your time. And again, we'll be sharing out, and people, please fill out your feedback form when you get it, and let us know if you have other things that you want to share with others, as we heard from Kimmy today. Enjoy the rest of your day. And again, thanks again, Kimmy. Have a great one.
Thank you. Have a good one.